LaToya had always loved mornings in her eatery. The sun was just rising, spilling golden light across the small town streets, and she enjoyed the quiet moments before the day became busy. She walked between the tables, wiping crumbs off the worn wooden surfaces, humming softly to herself. Her eatery was small, with just enough space for a dozen tables, but it had a charm that drew people in. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with sizzling bacon and fried chicken filled the air, welcoming anyone who walked through the door. Regulars waved and smiled, calling her by name, and she knew most of them as friends rather than customers. LaToya prided herself on running the place with care. Everything she did, from cooking to cleaning, came from a place of love. She remembered her mother teaching her how to season chicken properly and how to make the perfect cornbread. Those lessons stayed with her, and over the years her eatery became a reflection of who she was: warm, honest, and dependable. She liked things in order, but she also knew life could throw surprises, and she had learned to handle them as they came. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a deep rumbling sound reached her ears. It wasn't the usual traffic from the main street, and it wasn't any engine she had heard before. LaToya looked up and saw a motorcycle approaching from the distance. The rider wore a black leather jacket, the kind with patches that immediately drew attention. The Hells Angels insignia was emblazoned on the back. LaToya felt a slight chill run down her spine. She had heard of the group, of course. Stories about them were everywhere, some frightening, some exaggerated. But this man didn't seem aggressive. He seemed nervous. His hands gripped the handlebars tightly, and he kept glancing behind him as if he were expecting someone. Curiosity mixed with concern, and LaToya stepped closer to the window to watch. The man parked his bike carefully, even though the leather jacket made him look like he could crush the handlebars with his strength. He removed his helmet, revealing a face lined with experience and tension. His eyes scanned the surroundings, landing on her eatery, then quickly darting away as though he didn't want to be seen. Before LaToya could decide whether to approach him, the sound of sirens cut through the evening air. Police cars skidded around the corner, lights flashing, and officers jumped out with radios in hand. LaToya's heart sank as she watched the scene unfold. The man tried to step away, but the officers moved quickly, blocking him. Their voices were loud and commanding. They accused him of a fight outside town, and although it sounded like a minor issue, their tone made it clear they expected immediate compliance. LaToya's stomach tightened. She had seen situations escalate quickly before, but this felt different. She didn't know this man personally, but she sensed he was in trouble that wasn't fully his fault. And in that moment, she made a choice. She stepped out of her eatery, placing herself between the man and the officers. Her voice, steady but firm, cut through the tension. "Please stop. There's no need to get violent here. He's not causing any trouble in front of my eatery." The officers froze, surprised. They had not expected a civilian to intervene, much less a woman standing so confidently in the middle of the street. The man behind her, Ricky, she would later learn his name, looked at her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had seen many people avoid trouble at all costs, but here was someone putting herself at risk for him without hesitation. "Step aside, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice slightly harsher now, unsure how to handle the interruption. "This doesn't concern you," LaToya shook her head. "It does concern me," she said calmly. "I run this place. He hasn't done anything wrong here. Let's not make this worse than it already is." The air was thick with tension. Ricky's breathing was uneven, his muscles tense, ready to react if necessary. LaToya could feel the heat from the nearby engines of his bike and the flashing lights of the police cars. Yet something in her tone, the way she spoke without fear but also without aggression, made the officers hesitate. They were trained to assert control, but they weren't expecting courage combined with reason. Minutes felt like hours. LaToya held her ground, gently but firmly, gesturing for Ricky to stay calm. The man slowly relaxed his shoulders, trusting her judgment. The officers exchanged glances, uncertain how to proceed with someone standing between them and their target, speaking with such conviction. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the lead officer signaled his team to back off. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "We'll handle this later. Move along." Ricky let out a breath he had been holding for minutes, his body slumping with relief. He looked at LaToya with eyes that carried gratitude deeper than words could express. He nodded at her, a silent thank you that said more than anything he could have spoken. LaToya smiled gently, feeling a mix of pride and worry. She had done what she felt was right, but she also knew that standing up to the police was not something to be taken lightly. She hoped the situation was truly over, at least for now. Ricky didn't leave immediately. He stayed by the door of her eatery trying to collect himself. LaToya offered him a glass of water, which he accepted gratefully. They stood in silence for a moment, sharing a quiet understanding. He had faced danger countless times before, but this act of courage from someone he barely knew was rare and humbling. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally said, his voice low and sincere. "Most people would have just stayed inside." LaToya shook her head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was right. No one should be pushed around unfairly, not here, not anywhere." Ricky nodded slowly. He looked around her eatery, taking in the small, warm space filled with the smell of home-cooked food. It was a stark contrast to the harsh world he lived in, surrounded by tough bikers and constant tension. For a moment, he felt like he had stepped into a different life, one where kindness and courage mattered more than intimidation and fear. As the evening shadows lengthened, the police cars drove off, leaving the quiet town street once again in peace. LaToya and Ricky shared a moment of silence, acknowledging the unusual connection they had formed in just a few minutes. He eventually mounted his bike and rode away, glancing back once with a look that promised he would not forget her courage. LaToya watched him disappear into the distance, her heart still racing. She returned inside, closing the door gently behind her, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. Her regulars had watched from the windows, some wide-eyed, some whispering among themselves. She knew the story would spread fast. People in town would talk about the woman who had stood up to the police for a Hell's Angel, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that attention. She returned to her routine, wiping down tables, filling coffee cups, and serving the few customers who had stayed. But her mind kept drifting back to the man on the motorcycle and the strange, intense events that had unfolded in front of her eatery. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that her life and her small eatery was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As night fell, LaToya cleaned up and locked the door, glancing out at the quiet street. She felt a mix of pride, anxiety, and curiosity. The world was unpredictable, and sometimes courage was all it took to change the course of someone's life, even in ways she couldn't foresee. She went home that night with a restless mind but a quiet satisfaction, knowing she had acted from the heart, standing up for what was right, no matter the risk. The morning after the police incident, LaToya woke up earlier than usual. She couldn't sleep well. Her mind kept replaying the events of the previous evening. The man on the motorcycle, Ricky, had stayed in her thoughts. She didn't know why she cared so much about what happened to him, but something about the whole situation had left a mark. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, staring out at the quiet street, her mind full of questions. Would he come back? Would the story spread through the town in ways she didn't want? By mid-morning, her regular customers began trickling in, each offering their own quiet comments about what they had seen. Some were shocked that she had dared to step between a Hell's Angel and the police. Others were impressed by her courage. "I don't know how you did it," one of her regulars said, shaking his head. "I would have run the other way." LaToya smiled, brushing it off. "I just did what I thought was right," she replied simply. As she served breakfast, the bell above the door jingled and LaToya instinctively looked up. To her surprise, it wasn't her usual morning crowd. A man walked in wearing a black leather jacket. He removed his helmet and her eyes widened as recognition hit her. It was Ricky. He walked slowly, looking around as if gauging the room before approaching her counter. LaToya felt a mixture of caution and curiosity. She gestured toward a chair. "Sit," she said, keeping her voice steady. Ricky nodded, taking the seat, and she poured him a cup of coffee. He didn't say anything immediately, instead letting the quiet between them fill the space. Finally, Ricky spoke, his voice low but sincere. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Most people would have just stayed inside. You didn't think about yourself. You stepped in when it could have gone very wrong." LaToya shrugged slightly. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just didn't want to see someone treated unfairly. That's all." He studied her for a moment, his eyes showing a depth of emotion that seemed out of place for a man often judged by his rough exterior. "You're different," he said quietly. "Not many people would do what you did. I've seen a lot of fear, a lot of hesitation, but not from you. You have courage." Latoya felt a slight blush creep across her cheeks, though she tried to hide it. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially not ones like this. "I just care about people," she replied softly. Ricky nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The two of them sat in relative silence for a few minutes, the warmth of the eatery contrasting with the chill of the morning outside. Eventually, Ricky spoke again, this time more casually. "I probably should have introduced myself properly last night, but things were tense." Latoya smiled faintly. "I understood enough. You seemed like someone who didn't belong in that situation, and I didn't want to see things get worse." He leaned back in his chair, looking around the eatery. "This place, it's different, warm. People talk about loyalty and respect where I come from, but it's often mixed with aggression. Here, it's just simple, honest. It feels like a home." Latoya felt a flicker of pride. She had always wanted her eatery to be more than just a place to eat. She wanted it to be a space where people felt safe, where kindness mattered more than fear. And hearing Ricky say this confirmed that in some small way, she had achieved it. As Ricky finished his coffee, he glanced at the clock. "I should probably go," he said reluctantly, "but I wanted you to know that what you did, it didn't go unnoticed. My friends, my group, they'll hear about this." Latoya raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant. "They'll hear about it? Is that a good thing?" He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to lighten the tension. "It's a good thing for you, not me. They respect loyalty and courage. They respect people who stand up for what's right, even when it's risky. I think you might see them soon." Latoya's stomach tightened. The thought of more bikers showing up was both thrilling and frightening. She had no idea how many or what their intentions might be. Ricky stood, placing a hand on the counter briefly. "I'll make sure they come peacefully. Just be ready. They owe you respect." Latoya nodded, unsure what else to say. She watched him leave, the sound of his motorcycle fading into the distance. Her mind raced. She returned to her work, trying to focus on cooking and serving, but the anticipation hung over her like a shadow. By midday, rumors had already started spreading. People passing by whispered about the woman who had stood up to a Hell's Angel. Some laughed, thinking it was a bold story exaggerated over time. Others were genuinely impressed, spreading the word about her courage. Latoya's eatery began seeing new faces, curious customers who had heard the story and wanted to witness the place for themselves. She served them with her usual warmth, keeping her attention on the food and the little details that made her eatery special. As the afternoon wore on, Latoya noticed a few black motorcycles parked further down the street. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly moved to the window, watching as a small group of bikers approached her eatery on foot. They were large, intimidating men, some with leather jackets and patches she didn't recognize. Her mind raced. Were they here to thank her? Or had she misjudged the situation entirely? Ricky appeared at the front of the group, nodding at her before speaking in a voice she could hear over the quiet street. "We're not here to cause trouble," he called out. "We're here to show respect." Latoya exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. The bikers filed into her eatery, careful not to knock over chairs or bump into tables. Despite their size and reputation, they moved with a surprising sense of courtesy. Ricky introduced them one by one, explaining that they were friends and fellow riders who wanted to express their gratitude. The bikers ordered food, but they were more interested in talking to Latoya, learning about her life and her eatery. Latoya listened, asking questions, and realized that these men were not the dangerous figures people often assumed. They had their own stories, their own struggles, and their own ways of showing loyalty and respect. It was a side of them she had never expected to see. As the afternoon turned to evening, more bikers arrived, some traveling alone, some in small groups. Latoya watched in awe as the eatery filled with people she had never imagined would step through her door. The space felt alive, filled with conversation, laughter, and the clatter of plates. Despite the initial fear, she found herself enjoying the company. These were people who had experienced life on the edge, and yet, in her eatery, they were just people. Ricky stayed close by, keeping an eye on the group and occasionally exchanging a few words with Latoya. She began to understand him better, seeing that beneath the tough exterior was someone capable of thoughtfulness, gratitude, and loyalty. She realized that this unexpected bond, formed in just a few short hours, was changing her perception of the world. By nightfall, the bikers began to leave, thanking LaToya repeatedly. They promised to return not as threats but as friends. Ricky lingered a moment longer, giving her a nod that said more than words could. He mounted his motorcycle and rode off, disappearing into the night. LaToya locked the doors, exhausted but exhilarated. She had gone from a quiet evening to a day filled with tension, surprises, and new connections. She knew her life had changed, perhaps in ways she didn't yet understand. The small town she had always known now felt larger, more complex, and more connected than ever before. She went to bed that night with a sense of anticipation, wondering what the next day might bring, but also with a quiet pride knowing she had acted with courage, honesty, and heart. The next morning, LaToya woke up to a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. Her mind kept replaying the events of the previous day, and she couldn't help but wonder if the bikers would really come back. She went through her usual morning routine, making coffee, preparing eggs, and flipping pancakes, but her thoughts kept drifting to the motorcycles she had seen on the street and the unusual attention her eatery had suddenly received. By mid-morning, she had already seen a few curious faces outside her eatery. People who had heard the story were stopping to peek through the windows, whispering among themselves. LaToya felt a flutter of anxiety. The story had spread quickly, and while she had never sought attention, the attention was inevitable now. She tried to focus on her work, serving breakfast to the regular customers who had started their day as usual, unaware of the excitement building outside. Then she heard the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles growing louder in the distance. Her heart began to race. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window to see what was happening. Her eyes widened. More than 100 motorcycles were approaching, engines roaring, shining in the morning sun. It was a massive group, easily over 200 bikers riding in formation down the street toward her eatery. LaToya's stomach tightened. She had never seen anything like this before. She knew some bikers had reputations for causing trouble, but these were not strangers. These were the people Ricky had spoken about yesterday. They had come because of what she had done to show respect. Still, she couldn't help the flicker of fear rising in her chest. The motorcycles stopped in front of her eatery, filling the parking area and spilling onto the street. The ground seemed to tremble from the combined weight of the engines, and the noise was loud enough to make her step back. Slowly, the bikers began to dismount. Despite their intimidating appearance, leather jackets, tattoos, and patches that told stories of their life, they moved carefully and respectfully, making sure not to damage her property. Ricky was at the forefront of the group. He raised a hand and called out in a clear voice, "We're here to show respect. We don't want trouble." LaToya took a deep breath and opened the door. She stepped outside, trying to appear calm even though her heart was pounding. The bikers began filing into her eatery, filling every corner. LaToya could feel the heat of their presence, but instead of fear, she began to feel awe. They were here to honor her courage, not to intimidate. Ricky stepped forward again. "Everyone knows what she did for me," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. "She stood up when it mattered. We respect that. We're here to thank her properly." LaToya nodded, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She had always lived a quiet life, working hard and caring for her community, but she never expected her actions to have such an impact. The bikers began talking among themselves quietly, some shaking her hand, others nodding respectfully. They looked around the eatery, clearly impressed by the warmth and charm of the place. LaToya noticed that they weren't drinking excessively, nor were they being rowdy. Their behavior surprised her. These men, often judged harshly by the public, were here to show gratitude, nothing more. Some of the bikers ordered food, while others simply sat and watched, taking in the sights and smells of the eatery. LaToya moved around, serving them with care, trying to maintain the same warmth she offered all her customers. Despite the initial tension, a sense of calm settled over the room. One of the bikers, a tall man with a shaved head and a thick beard, leaned toward LaToya and said softly, "We don't often meet people like you. People who don't judge us for who we are. We appreciate that." LaToya smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I don't judge people by their appearance," she said gently. "Everyone deserves kindness. Everyone deserves respect, Ricky nodded at her, giving her a small smile of approval. You understand what loyalty and respect mean. That's why we're here. As the morning turned into afternoon, more bikers arrived, bringing the total number to over 200. The street outside was filled with motorcycles, drawing the attention of locals who had never seen anything like it. People stopped on the sidewalks, taking pictures and whispering in amazement. LaToya's eatery had become the center of attention, but she focused on what mattered, keeping her customers, both regular and new, comfortable and happy. The bikers shared stories of their travels, their lives on the road, and the challenges they faced in their world. LaToya listened, fascinated. She realized that these men were more than the stereotypes she had heard about. Many had faced hardship, discrimination, and danger, yet they had maintained a sense of loyalty and camaraderie that she admired. Ricky sat down with her for a moment during a brief lull. I wanted them to see what I saw, he said quietly. A place where people are treated fairly, where courage is respected. You've done something that most of us never forget. LaToya felt a warmth in her chest. She had never expected such recognition, but it wasn't about fame. It was about being human, about standing up for someone when they needed it. That was all she had done. As the afternoon wore on, the bikers began to leave one by one, shaking her hand and expressing their gratitude. They promised to return, not as strangers but as friends. LaToya realized that what had started as a simple act of courage had created connections she never imagined. By evening, the street was quiet again. LaToya sat at one of the tables, exhausted but filled with a sense of fulfillment. She reflected on the day's events, realizing that courage and kindness had the power to transform lives in unexpected ways. She had taken a risk and it had paid off, not in money but in respect, understanding, and human connection. LaToya locked the doors of her eatery and stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. She glanced down the street, imagining the bikers riding back to their lives, carrying with them the story of her courage. She smiled, knowing that her actions had made a difference, and that sometimes standing up for what was right could create bonds that lasted a lifetime. She went home that night with a sense of peace, though her mind was already buzzing with anticipation for what might come next. The world felt bigger now, more unpredictable but also more connected. She had learned that courage, kindness, and understanding could bridge worlds that seemed impossible to bring together. LaToya drifted to sleep thinking about the bikers, about Ricky, and about the unexpected chain of events that had changed her life and her eatery forever. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she felt ready, knowing that sometimes all it took was one brave step to change everything. Days turned into weeks, and LaToya's eatery returned to its usual rhythm, though the memory of the bikers' visit lingered in her mind. Life had not gone back to being completely quiet. The story of her courage had traveled fast through the town, and while most people respected her actions, she noticed a change in the way her community viewed her. People who had once only waved politely now nodded with admiration. Even strangers would stop at the door, curious about the woman who had stood up to a Hell's Angel and earned the respect of hundreds of bikers. LaToya found it strange but quietly satisfying. She had never sought recognition. She simply acted as she felt was right. Ricky continued to visit her eatery, though not as frequently as the first few days. When he did, it was often just him or a small group of bikers. They no longer arrived en masse, but their presence brought a sense of security and familiarity. LaToya began to see another side of Ricky. Behind the tattoos, the leather, and the tough exterior was a man who valued honesty, loyalty, and trust more than most. He told stories of his travels across the country, of nights spent on lonely highways and the camaraderie he shared with his fellow bikers. LaToya listened with fascination. She realized that life on the road was harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it was also filled with codes of respect and friendship that she admired. One afternoon, as she was washing dishes, Ricky approached the counter with a small smile. "I brought someone with me today," he said. LaToya looked up to see two bikers following him. One was younger, polite, and soft-spoken, while the other was older, broad-shouldered, but surprisingly gentle in his demeanor. "We wanted to say hello," Ricky explained. "We don't want to overwhelm you, but we thought you might like to know some of us personally." LaToya felt a little nervous at first, unsure how to interact with so many people who seemed larger than life. But as they began talking, she found that they were genuinely curious about her, about the eatery, and about her life. They asked questions, shared laughs, and told her that they admired how she had stood up when it mattered. They were not there to boast or intimidate, they were there to connect. Over the next few weeks, these visits became more regular. LaToya noticed that her eatery was slowly becoming a place where different worlds could meet. Locals, bikers, and travelers alike shared tables, exchanged stories, and discovered a sense of community that transcended appearances. LaToya watched people she had assumed were very different from each other find common ground through simple conversation and shared meals. She realized that what she had feared as chaos was, in fact, the beginning of something remarkable. Ricky sometimes stayed behind after the others left, and their conversations grew longer and deeper. He told her about the struggles of being part of a group that many misunderstood. "People think we are only troublemakers," he said one afternoon, "but most of us live by a code. Loyalty, respect, honesty. It's not perfect, but it's what keeps us together." LaToya nodded, understanding more than she could have imagined. "I think people just see what they want to see," she replied. "They focus on the outside, on what looks dangerous or scary. They don't see the heart of it." Ricky smiled, clearly appreciating her insight. "Exactly, and you saw beyond all that. You acted without fear. That's rare." The days continued, and LaToya found herself reflecting on how much the visits had changed her perspective. She realized that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and patient. It was in standing up for someone who couldn't defend themselves, in listening without judgment, and in offering kindness where it wasn't expected. The bikers respected her boundaries and never tried to impose themselves. They appreciated her space and her efforts, and in return, LaToya began to understand them, not as outsiders to fear, but as people with their own struggles, their own values, and their own ways of finding family and friendship. She began to see that the world was far more complex than she had imagined, and that courage and kindness could bridge even the widest gaps. One rainy afternoon, LaToya was preparing lunch when a knock came at the door. She looked up to see Ricky and a few other bikers standing outside, umbrellas shielding them from the rain. "We thought you might like some company," Ricky said with a grin. They came in, dripping wet, and she handed them towels with a laugh. They sat down at a table near the window, watching the rain together. The conversation flowed easily. They talked about the road, about the people they met, about life in a way that felt honest and unguarded. LaToya shared her own experiences, the challenges of running the eatery and the moments of doubt she had faced. The bikers listened with genuine interest, and when she laughed, their laughter joined hers, filling the small space with warmth and a sense of connection that was almost tangible. As the afternoon passed, LaToya noticed something remarkable. The eatery, once just a place to eat, had become a bridge between worlds. People who might never have spoken to each other were now sharing stories, meals, and laughter. The bikers were no longer distant figures of fear or curiosity. They were part of her community, and she was part of theirs. Ricky stayed behind after the others left again, as was becoming routine. "I want to thank you," he said quietly, "for letting us in, for not judging, for treating us like we matter." LaToya shook her head, smiling softly. "You do matter. Every person does. Sometimes people just need someone to notice that." Ricky nodded thoughtfully. "You've changed a lot of things without even realizing it. You've shown people that courage isn't always about fighting or being tough. Sometimes it's about doing what's right, even when it's scary." LaToya felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had never considered herself extraordinary. She had simply done what she believed was right. But hearing Ricky say it out loud, seeing the respect in his eyes, made her realize that even small acts of courage could ripple outward, affecting people and communities in ways she hadn't imagined. The days continued to pass, and LaToya found a quiet joy in the new rhythm her eatery had found. She learned to enjoy the presence of the bikers, not as outsiders or threats, but as friends who respected her space, and her life. She realized that human connection was not about appearances or reputations. It was about trust, respect, and honesty. By the end of the month, the eatery had become a place of stories and friendships. Locals and bikers alike would come and sit together, sharing meals and laughter. LaToya sometimes caught herself smiling quietly as she observed the conversations around her, thinking about how much life had changed since that evening when she had stepped between Ricky and the police. She realized that courage and kindness had the power to create bonds, to bring people together in ways that no one could have predicted. LaToya went to bed each night reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She thought about how fear could be transformed into understanding, how judgment could be replaced with respect, and how a single act of bravery could inspire trust and friendship. She knew that the world could be harsh, unfair, and unpredictable, but she also knew that courage, kindness, and empathy could light the way, building connections and changing lives, and so, life continued with her eatery remaining a symbol of courage, kindness, and unexpected friendship. The bikers respected her, she respected them, and together they had discovered that sometimes, the most unlikely encounters could leave the most lasting impressions. Months had passed since that evening when LaToya had stepped between Ricky and the police. Life in her small town had slowly settled into a new rhythm, but her eatery was no longer just a place to eat. It had become something more, a hub where stories were shared, friendships were formed, and respect was earned and given freely. LaToya walked through the tables each morning, greeting her regular customers with the same warmth she always had. But now there was a subtle shift. People looked at her differently with admiration in their eyes. They saw not just a talented cook, but a woman who had the courage to stand up when it mattered most. Ricky and the bikers continued to visit, though not in overwhelming numbers as they had initially. Sometimes it was just Ricky, sometimes a few friends, and occasionally a larger group came to share a meal or simply to sit in the eatery and enjoy the comfort it offered. LaToya had come to understand their world better. She realized that despite the intimidating appearance of leather jackets and tattoos, there was a code they lived by, a code that valued loyalty, respect, and honesty. She had been an outsider at first, but now she felt connected to them in a way she had never expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ricky arrived with a small group of bikers. They had traveled from a neighboring town just to spend time at the eatery. LaToya greeted them at the door, her heart warming at the sight of familiar faces. The group moved with quiet confidence, their presence commanding yet non-threatening. They had learned to respect her space, and she had learned to trust them. Ricky walked up to her and said, "I wanted to bring them here to meet you properly. They've heard about what you did, and they wanted to see it for themselves." LaToya nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. She had never sought recognition. Her actions had been instinctive, driven by a sense of what was right. But seeing the respect in their eyes, she understood that her courage had made a difference not just for Ricky, but for an entire community that valued loyalty and honesty. As the evening unfolded, the eatery was filled with conversation, laughter, and the clatter of plates. LaToya moved between tables, serving food, refilling drinks, and listening to the stories of the bikers. She learned about the challenges they faced on the road, the risks they took, and the bonds they formed with each other. She realized that these men, often misunderstood by the public, had hearts as human as anyone else's. They experienced fear, joy, loyalty, and loss, just like anyone else. Ricky leaned toward her during a quiet moment and said, "You've shown us something important. Courage doesn't always mean fighting or being strong in the way people expect. Sometimes it's about standing up, calmly and wisely when no one else will. That's what you did for me." LaToya smiled softly. "I didn't think about it like that. I just did what I felt was right," he nodded. "And that's why it mattered so much. It changed things. Not just for me, but for everyone who heard about it." The bikers stayed into the evening, sharing stories and laughter. LaToya found herself enjoying their company more than she had imagined. They respected her boundaries, appreciated her kindness, and treated her eatery as a place of comfort and warmth, not just a place to eat. It was clear to her that respect could bridge worlds that often seemed impossible to connect. As the night wore on, the bikers began to leave, one by one, shaking her hand and expressing their gratitude. Each departure left LaToya with a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had not sought this attention, but she recognized the impact of her actions. She had stood up when it mattered, and in doing so, had created connections that would last far beyond a single encounter. After the last of the bikers had left, LaToya closed the doors of her eatery and took a deep breath. The street was quiet, the evening cool and still. She walked through the empty space, reflecting on everything that had happened since that fateful night. She thought about Ricky, about the bikers, and about the ripple effect that one act of courage could have. Her small eatery had become a symbol of bravery, kindness, and unexpected friendship. LaToya realized that life had a way of surprising her. She had never imagined that a single moment, a single decision to protect someone in need, could lead to such profound changes. It had not just affected Ricky or the bikers, but her entire community. People had begun to see her in a new light, and she had begun to see the world with a broader, more understanding perspective. She thought about the lessons she had learned. Courage was not about being fearless, it was about acting despite fear. Kindness was not about expecting rewards, it was about doing what was right. Respect was not about appearances, it was about understanding and valuing the humanity in others. These truths had become clear to her through the interactions with Ricky and the bikers, and they had changed her life in ways she had never anticipated. Over the following months, the eatery continued to thrive. Locals and travelers alike came to enjoy not just the food, but the atmosphere of warmth, understanding, and community that LaToya had nurtured. The bikers became a regular, respected presence, not as outsiders, but as part of a growing network of trust and friendship. LaToya had created something rare, a place where courage, kindness, and respect could exist side by side, uniting people from different walks of life. One evening, as LaToya closed up for the night, Ricky stopped by one last time before heading back to the road. "I just wanted to say thank you again," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've changed things not just for me, but for everyone who knows your story. People remember courage, people remember kindness, and we will never forget yours." LaToya smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "I didn't do it to be remembered," she said softly. "I just did what felt right. But I'm glad it has meant something." Ricky nodded, giving her a small nod of respect before mounting his motorcycle and riding off into the night. LaToya watched him go, the engine's rumble fading into the distance. She felt a quiet sense of closure, knowing that what had started as a tense, frightening encounter had blossomed into a story of courage, community, and human connection. As she walked through the empty eatery one last time that night, she reflected on the journey she had been through. She had learned that one act of bravery could change not only her life, but the lives of others. She had discovered the unexpected kindness and loyalty of people she had initially feared. She had realized that respect and understanding could bridge worlds that seemed impossible to connect. LaToya went to bed that night with a heart full of gratitude and a mind filled with hope. She knew that life would continue to bring challenges and surprises, but she also knew that courage, kindness, and respect could guide her through anything. Her eatery remained a place of warmth, connection, and stories, a testament to the power of standing up for what was right and the enduring impact of human compassion. The story of that night, of Ricky, the bikers, and her courage, would be remembered in the town for years to come. People would talk about the woman who stood up when it mattered, who bridged worlds with kindness and bravery, and who transformed a small eatery into a symbol of hope and understanding. LaToya herself did not need recognition. She carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done the right thing, and that her actions had made a lasting difference in the lives of many. And so, life continued in the small town. LaToya's eatery thrived, her community grew closer, and her bond with Ricky and the bikers remained strong. She had learned that even a single act of courage could ripple outward, creating change and building connections that would last far beyond a single moment. Through it all, LaToya remained humble, kind, and courageous, a living example of how one person's heart and actions could touch the lives of many.